So it's hard to really say, but listen, I do watch Hasan pretty often. I think he's hilarious. I don't agree with all of his political takes, but I would say that for Hasan to, be in full alignment with his values, he should be a vegan. I mean, he will literally be on stream sometimes yelling about some kind of awful treatment that a certain marginalized and oppressed group is experiencing while munching on the dismembered corpse of the most marginalized and oppressed group on the planet. His daily food choices literally support a Holocaust, and that's a problem. Hey, what is up guys? So in my last video on Hasan Piker, I said that, if the rest of his video that I wasn't able to criticize was super cringy, I would end up making a part 2, and it was the case that the rest of his video was super cringy, and therefore here we are, part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I will link part 1 in the pinned comment and make it appear right here on the top right of the screen. With all that aside, let's get into the video.
So it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, unless you want to be really just disingenuous and uncharitable and just shit on vegans, which I do a lot for the memes, but ultimately they are still morally correct.
Okay. So we've all heard this kind of thing where we have a non-vegan who, in a very reasonable fashion, ends up admitting that the vegan moral philosophy is right and that vegans are right in their pursuit of, reducing animal abuse, but they just won't do it themselves. Now, of course, any real ethical vegan is going to hear this and appreciate that the person is at least skipping past all of the nonsense arguments people tend to make against vegans and is accepting the common sense idea that animal abuse is wrong and that vegans are right to try and minimize it as much as reasonably possible. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there is a different kind of problem with a person like Hasan who thinks that veganism is right versus somebody who isn't convinced that veganism is right. With someone like Hasan, he is convinced that he ought to behave in a certain way, but decides not to, while in the case of these other types of non-vegans, they aren't convinced that they ought to behave in a certain way. Depending on your view of morality, you might view Hasan as worse than other non-vegans because unlike them, he is aware that veganism is something he ought to pursue, but decides not to. And when we contextualize this further, Hasan looks even worse because he is in a position where going vegan is actually unbelievably easy. He makes upwards of $200,000 per month. I mean, the options are seemingly infinite. He could even hire a vegan chef if he wanted to and experience all of the sensory pleasure he derives from non-vegan food from vegan food, while in the process not supporting the literal worst oppression on the planet. Just gonna interrupt the video real quick as we zoom into this beautiful site. I forgot to mention that Hasan also lives in Los Angeles, California, which is literally the second most vegan-friendly city in the United States. I believe first is Portland, Oregon. But yeah, I mean, just think of all these things I've just listed, plus that, it, really makes him not being vegan look awful. Let's move on. And this is all the more ironic given how strong of a stance Hasan holds against the oppression of human marginalized groups. He is extremely vocal on these topics, yet is convinced that veganism is right, has the resources to experience veganism in a more convenient way than 99% of vegans, but still decides to not go vegan and continues to fund the commodification, rape, exploitation, lifetime confinement, and murder of animals every single day. I mean, he will literally be on stream sometimes yelling about some kind of awful treatment that a certain marginalized and oppressed group is experiencing while munching on the dismembered corpse of the most marginalized and oppressed group on the planet. Listen, I watch Hasan a lot. I think he's a very funny dude and generally his heart is in the right spot. But this is the kind of stuff that blows my mind coming from a creator like him.
Secondly, of course animals are oppressed. It's just that I don't think animals, like non-human animals, are of the same level of worth as human animals are. I think humans, by virtue of being human and nothing else, have hold on to this intrinsic value. I believe that they have this value and therefore are elevated on the food chain for me.
So I've already covered this topic in my part 1 responding to Hasan, but I'll just say really quick that being vegan does not necessarily entail valuing human animals the same as non-human animals. You can recognize both beings have different levels of moral value while also recognizing that both shouldn't be stabbed in the throat for a hamburger. And second, I find it interesting that Hasan is taking a purely speciesist take and saying that, humans, just in virtue of being human, have this intrinsic moral value, which animals don't have. This kind of appeal to group membership is really no different from the appeals to group membership racists would make back in the day, or even today, to justify different moral treatment between different groups of races. Imagine just saying that white people have intrinsic moral value just by virtue of being white. If Hasan were to, instead of be a speciesist, just operate as somebody who values sentience, he still could make the case, in most cases, that humans have higher, moral value than non-human animals. But instead, he decides to make this blatant appeal to species, which really is no different from a, arbitrary appeal to group membership, which he opposes greatly in the context of race.
Why do you think a life is worth more if it's a human intrinsically? You don't explain your reasoning at all. This is just say this is what I believe. It's just what I believe. I think by virtue of being a human being, our species is worth more than the life of another animal. Now, there are qualifiers to that. There are situations where that could change, right? I'm not going to try to get into an argument about would you save the worst human being over the best dog that you love? You know what I mean? Like a worse human being that's killed multiple people. These sorts of arguments are idiotic. Just like on the other side, the argument that I could stun lock you with is if you're stranded on a fucking island and you have a human and a dog, do you eat the human first or do you eat the dog first? Of course you eat the dog first. And most honest vegans would admit that, unless they would look like a fucking psycho.
I mean, it's just a fact that one can kill a dog instead of a human on a stranded island for reasons outside of species. For example, sentience. So this whole, stun lock attempt at Hasan to, bring the argument back to vegans in an attempt to show us exhibiting speciesism really just fails. So I just want to end this video with a final just question, right? What kind of person is somebody who has infinite funds able to go vegan, somebody who fights against human oppression on a daily basis, it seems, who is aware that they should go vegan, who is aware of the atrocities that animals are going through, who also lives in the second most vegan city in the United States, but decides to not go vegan? Now, to non-vegans watching and Hasan fans, I'm sure I just sound like a shaming vegan, whatever, but really just think about what it means to be aware of all this cruelty and have all the power to stop supporting said cruelty, and instead of not supporting said cruelty, you just continue to. Does this mean Hasan is a fraud? Is it just a lot harder for him to empathize with animals? Is he really operating under a sort of speciesist mental framework when it comes to judging things? Who really knows? Even if you take into account that human beings are on average higher sentience than animals, and that if you compare your average human to an average, cow, the human has more value. Even if we take that into account, it is a fact that animals are the most oppressed beings on this planet, and your avoidance of their oppression is just unbelievably easy. Not to mention the impact that Hasan can have if he were to go vegan. I mean, he has such a massive reach with respect to the left side of the political spectrum online. Imagine if he went vegan. And this is where my sort of speculation comes in. It might just be because he doesn't want to push away his followers. Who really knows? I mean, if he were to chase animal rights to the same degree that he chases human rights, he'd probably annoy a lot of people and possibly lose subs and, lose money as a result. So it's hard to really say, but, listen, I do watch Hasan pretty often. I think he's hilarious. I don't agree with all of his political takes, but I would say that for Hasan to, be in full alignment with his values, he should be a vegan. And I don't care how culty that sounds. It's just a fact that, his daily food choices literally support a Holocaust, and that's a problem.
Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid